The crisp autumn evening was drawing to a close as Marcus Thompson guided his black Mercedes sedan through the quiet streets of Oak Hill, a suburban neighborhood in Atlanta. At 52 years old, Marcus had spent the last 15 years serving as a criminal court judge, earning respect throughout the legal community for his fair-mindedness and dedication to justice. He had just finished his weekly Sunday dinner with his elderly mother, a tradition he maintained since his father's passing 3 years ago. The digital clock on his dashboard read 9:45 p.m. as he carefully navigated the familiar road home, his mind preoccupied with the heavy caseload awaiting him the next morning. The flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror caught him by surprise. Marcus checked his speedometer. He was driving exactly at the speed limit. Years of legal experience had taught him to always follow traffic rules meticulously, especially as a black man driving in certain neighborhoods. Following standard procedure, Marcus turned on his interior lights and placed both hands visible on the steering wheel. Through his side mirror, he observed two police officers approaching his vehicle, Officers James Barrett and Michael Conway, though he didn't know their names yet. Barrett, a stocky white man in his mid-30s, approached the driver's side while Conway, younger and taller, positioned himself on the passenger side. "License and registration," Barrett demanded, his tone unnecessarily harsh. There was no good evening or explanation for the stop, a departure from standard police protocol that immediately set off warning bells in Marcus's mind. "Good evening, officer," Marcus replied calmly, maintaining his professional demeanor. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" Barrett's face hardened. "I said license and registration. We asked the questions here." Marcus noticed Conway's hand resting on his holstered weapon, despite there being no apparent threat. With slow, deliberate movements, he reached for his wallet and vehicle documents. "My license and registration are in the glove compartment and my wallet, respectively. I'm going to reach for them now," Marcus announced clearly, following the safety protocols he'd advised countless others to use in similar situations. As he handed over his documentation, Barrett shined his flashlight directly into Marcus's face, the beam unnecessarily bright and hostile. The judge remained composed, though he couldn't help but notice how the officer's demeanor contrasted sharply with the respectful treatment he usually received when recognized as a judge. "Step out of the vehicle," Barrett suddenly ordered, despite having not yet even examined the documents. "Officer, I don't understand. I haven't committed any traffic violation. Could you please explain the reason for this stop?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but firm. "I said get out of the car." Barrett's voice rose significantly. "You really want to make this difficult?" Marcus's heart rate increased, but his exterior remained calm. 25 years in the legal system had taught him that situations like these could escalate dangerously fast. He thought of his mother, who would be expecting his usual call to confirm he'd made it home safely. As he carefully unbuckled his seatbelt, Marcus noticed Officer Conway had moved closer, his stance aggressive. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Marcus could sense the officer's prejudices overshadowing their professional judgment. "I'm complying, officers," Marcus stated clearly, knowing his dash cam was recording the interaction. "But I want to note that I'm being cooperative while expressing my right to understand the reason for this stop." The cool night air hit his face as he stepped out of his car. The familiar weight of his judge's ID card rested in his breast pocket, but something told Marcus not to reveal this position yet. Years on the bench had taught him about the importance of understanding the justice system from all angles. Barrett roughly grabbed Marcus's arm, spinning him to face the car. "Spread your legs and put your hands on the vehicle." As Marcus assumed the position, he could feel the eyes of passing cars on the scene. He wondered how many similar scenarios played out every night, involving citizens who didn't have his legal knowledge or resources. The irony wasn't lost on him. Tomorrow morning, he would be presiding over cases in the very courthouse where he might end up spending the night. The sounds of crickets and distant traffic filled the tense silence as Officer Barrett began an aggressive pat-down, while Conway maintained his intimidating stance, hands still resting on his weapon. What started as a routine drive home was about to become a night that would change multiple lives forever. The pat-down continued with unnecessary roughness as Officer Barrett's hands moved across Marcus's expensive suit. The fabric of his jacket bunched uncomfortably under the officer's aggressive movements, and Marcus could feel Barrett's hostility in every touch. "What's this?" Barrett suddenly demanded, pulling Marcus's wallet from his back pocket, despite having already been handed Marcus's license moments before. "That's my wallet, officer. You already have my license from it," Marcus replied calmly, maintaining his composure even as his patience was being tested. Barrett opened the wallet, carelessly dropping several business cards onto the wet pavement. His eyes narrowed as he saw the judicial ID card, but in his haste and prejudice, he barely glanced at it. "Pretty fancy wallet for this neighborhood," Conway remarked from behind, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Where'd you get a wallet like that?" "I purchased it legally, with my own money, from a department store," Marcus answered, knowing full well the implications behind the question. His response was met with a derisive snort from Barrett. "Yeah, sure you did," Barrett muttered, continuing to rifle through the wallet's contents. "What are you doing in this area anyway? This is a nice neighborhood." The implication was clear. They didn't believe a black man belonged in Oak Hill. Marcus felt a familiar weight in his chest, one he'd carried since childhood, even as he'd risen through the ranks of the legal profession. "I was visiting my mother, who lives 3 blocks from here," Marcus explained, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "I've been driving this route every Sunday for the past 20 years. "A likely story," Conway interjected, moving closer. "You know how many criminals we catch using that exact excuse." Marcus noticed a young couple walking their dog on the opposite sidewalk, slowing down to observe the scene. The woman had her phone out, likely recording the interaction. He made a mental note of the potential witnesses. "Officers, I still haven't been informed of why I was stopped," Marcus stated firmly. "I was driving within the speed limit, my tags are current, and my lights are functioning properly. What is the probable cause for this stop?" Barrett's face reddened at the legal terminology. "Oh, so you're a lawyer now. Think you know the law better than us?" "Your taillight was out," Conway added quickly, though Marcus knew this was a fabrication. He had checked all his lights just that morning, as was his habit. "That's incorrect, officer. My lights were checked this morning and are in perfect working order. Your dash cam and body cameras should confirm this," Marcus responded, his years of courtroom experience evident in his measured tone. This seemed to anger Barrett further. He stepped uncomfortably close to Marcus, his breath hot against Marcus's ear. "You calling us liars?" Before Marcus could respond, Barrett roughly grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. The sudden movement caught Marcus off guard, causing him to lose his balance slightly. "Stop resisting," Conway shouted, though Marcus had done nothing of the sort. The false accusation was a familiar tactic that Marcus had heard about countless times in his courtroom. "I'm not resisting," Marcus stated clearly, making sure his voice would be picked up by the body cameras. "I am complying fully while asserting my legal rights." "Shut up," Barrett growled, slamming Marcus against the car with unnecessary force. The impact caused Marcus's glasses to fall, clattering onto the pavement. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest and disorderly conduct." The absurdity of being arrested for resisting an arrest that had no initial cause might have been amusing in different circumstances. Instead, Marcus felt the cold bite of handcuffs around his wrists as they were ratcheted unnecessarily tight. More cars were slowing down now, their headlights illuminating the scene. Marcus could see people in their houses coming to their windows, drawn by the commotion. The young couple with the dog had stopped completely, the woman still recording while her partner made a phone call. As Barrett roughly guided him toward the patrol car, Marcus maintained his dignity. He knew that everything happening now would eventually come to light. His only concern was for his elderly mother, who would soon be wondering why he hadn't called to say he'd made it home safely. "Watch your head," Conway said mockingly as Barrett shoved Marcus into the back of the patrol car with much more force than necessary. The door slammed shut, and Marcus found himself in a position he'd never imagined being in the back of a police car, watching his own vehicle grow smaller in the distance as they drove away into the night. The patrol car's interior smelled of stale coffee and cleaning products as it wound through the darkened streets. Marcus sat quietly in the back, his wrists aching from the overly tight handcuffs. Through the mesh divider, he could hear Officers Barrett and Conway congratulating themselves, completely unaware of the storm they were creating. "These people always think they know their rights," Conway responded, glancing back at Marcus through the rearview mirror with obvious disdain. Marcus remained silent, mentally documenting every word and action. Years on the bench had taught him the value of careful observation. He noticed how neither officer had read him his Miranda rights, another procedural violation to add to the growing list. At the precinct, they pulled into the brightly lit Sallyport, the garage door rumbling shut behind them. Barrett yanked open the back door, roughly pulling Marcus out by his arm. The judge winced as his shoulder twisted awkwardly, but he maintained his composure. "Welcome to your new home for the night," Conway sneered, pushing Marcus toward the booking area. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they approached the processing desk, where a tired-looking sergeant sat shuffling papers. "What have we got here?" the sergeant asked, barely looking up from his paperwork. "Resisting arrest and disorderly conduct," Barrett reported, his voice carrying an unearned authority. Subject was combative during a routine traffic stop. Marcus noticed the sergeant's nameplate read Anderson as the older man finally looked up. His eyes widened slightly as they met Marcus's, a flicker of recognition crossing his face before he quickly masked it. "Name?" Anderson asked, his tone notably more professional than the arresting officer's. "Marcus Thompson," he replied calmly, watching as Anderson's fingers hesitated over the keyboard. The sergeant's face remained neutral, but his posture had changed subtly. "Empty your pockets," Conway commanded, shoving a plastic bin across the desk. With his hands still cuffed, Marcus could only stand there. "I'll need these restraints removed to comply with that order," he stated matter-of-factly. Barrett roughly removed the handcuffs, causing Marcus to wince again as the metal scraped against his already bruised wrists. Deliberately, Marcus removed his phone, keys, and the contents of his pockets, including his judge's credentials, which he had chosen not to reveal during the arrest. Anderson's eyes fixed on the judicial ID card as it clattered into the bin. His face paled visibly, and he quickly picked up his desk phone, turning away from the group. "What's he doing?" Barrett demanded, but his question was cut short as the door burst open and Lieutenant Sarah Chen strode in, her face a mask of concern. "Officers Barrett and Conway," she barked. "Step away from Judge Thompson immediately." The change in the room was instantaneous. Both officers froze, their faces draining of color as they slowly turned to look at their prisoner in a new light. Marcus stood tall, straightening his rumpled jacket with as much dignity as he could muster. "Judge Thompson," Barrett stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating. "The criminal court judge." "The very same," Lieutenant Chen confirmed, her voice tight with controlled anger. The judge who, coincidentally, has been leading the department's training sessions on racial bias and proper arrest procedures for the past 5 years. Conway had backed against the wall, looking like he might be sick. Barrett's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "Lieutenant," Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority that came from years on the bench. "I believe these officers need to be relieved of duty pending a full investigation." "Already done, Your Honor," Chen replied, shooting a withering look at the two officers. "I've contacted Internal Affairs, and they're on their way. We'll need your full statement, of course, but first, please allow me to apologize on behalf of the department." Marcus nodded, watching as 2 other officers entered to escort Barrett and Conway away. Their badges and weapons were collected, and they were led to separate interview rooms, their swagger replaced by obvious fear. "Your mother has been notified that you're safe," Chen added softly. "And your car is being brought here. Would you like us to arrange transportation home?" "No, thank you," Marcus replied, straightening his tie. "I'll drive myself, but I will expect to see all body camera footage and relevant documentation on my desk first thing tomorrow morning." As he gathered his belongings, Marcus could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him. What had started as a humiliating arrest had transformed into a powerful moment of reckoning. Tomorrow, the real work would begin, ensuring that what happened to him tonight wouldn't happen to anyone else. Despite Lieutenant Chen's attempts to release him immediately, Marcus made an unexpected decision that would later prove crucial. "I wish to remain in custody," he announced, surprising everyone in the booking area. "Process me like any other citizen." The lieutenant's protest died on her lips as she recognized the determined look in the judge's eyes. Marcus knew that experiencing the system firsthand would provide invaluable insight into the treatment of ordinary citizens who didn't have his privileges and connections. "Are you certain, Your Honor?" Anderson asked, his fingers hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. "Completely," Marcus replied. Process me according to standard procedure. I want the full experience. Minus the illegal parts, of course," he added with a pointed look at where Barrett and Conway had disappeared. The booking process began. Marcus stood against the wall for his mugshot, the flash catching the weariness in his eyes. His fingerprints were taken, each digit pressed carefully onto the scanner by an officer who seemed terrified of hurting him. As he changed into the orange jumpsuit, Marcus noticed the stark difference in how he was being treated now that his identity was known. The same officers who had watched his rough treatment earlier were now almost comically gentle, their "sir" and "your honor" punctuating every sentence. In the holding cell, Marcus sat on the hard metal bench, observing his surroundings with keen interest. The cell was cold, the fluorescent lights harsh and unforgiving. Across the way, a young black man sat hunched in his own cell, occasionally glancing up at Marcus with curiosity. "First time?" the young man finally asked, breaking the silence. "Yes," Marcus answered honestly. "Yours?" "Third," the young man replied with a bitter laugh. "Name's Derek. Got pulled over for a broken taillight that wasn't even broken. Story's probably familiar to you." Marcus nodded, noting the parallel to his own false arrest. "What happened then?" "They said they smelled marijuana. There wasn't any, but you know how it goes. Can't afford a lawyer, so I'll probably take whatever deal the public defender suggests, even though I'm innocent." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more detainees. Throughout the night, Marcus watched as the cells filled and emptied. He observed the patterns: who was treated roughly, who was handled with care, who was ignored completely. At one point, a drunk white businessman was brought in, loudly proclaiming his innocence and demanding his phone call. The officers treated him with remarkable patience, even as he hurled insults at them. The contrast with how other detainees were treated was stark. Marcus used the same bathroom facilities as everyone else, ate the same bland sandwich for breakfast, and experienced the same uncomfortable attempts at sleep on the hard bench. He documented everything mentally: the temperature, the lighting, the noise levels, the attitudes of the officers, the processing times. Around 3 a.m., an elderly black woman was brought in for what appeared to be a minor shoplifting charge. She was trembling, clearly terrified. Marcus watched as she was processed, noting how no one explained her rights to her properly, how she signed papers without understanding them. "Ma'am," he called out quietly when she was placed in a nearby cell, "make sure you request a public defender before signing anything else. It's your right." The woman looked at him gratefully, nodding. A guard passing by gave Marcus a sharp look, but said nothing, perhaps remembering who he was. As dawn approached, Marcus had filled 2 mental notebooks worth of observations. He'd witnessed procedural violations, casual discrimination, and systemic issues that were invisible from the bench, but glaringly obvious from this side of the bars. He thought about every case he presided over, every defendant who'd stood before him. How many had spent nights like this? How many had made decisions about their cases based on the desperation to escape these conditions rather than actual guilt or innocence? When morning finally came, bringing with it the shift change and increased activity, Marcus had developed a new understanding that no amount of legal training could have provided. He had seen the justice system not as it was presented in his courtroom, but as it existed in reality for those without power or privilege. As he waited for the morning processing to begin, Marcus began mentally drafting the changes he would implement in his courtroom. The night in custody had been enlightening, and he intended to ensure that every lesson learned would translate into meaningful reform. The courthouse bustled with its usual morning activity as attorneys, court officers, and defendants filed through security. At 8:30 a.m. sharp, Court Officer James Wilson was making his routine check of the holding cells when he stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the figure in orange sitting calmly on the bench. "Judge Thompson?" Wilson's voice cracked with disbelief. "What are you? How are you?" Marcus looked up from his seated position, offering a small smile. "Good morning, James. Yes, it's exactly what it looks like." Word spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Within minutes, District Attorney Sarah Martinez burst into the holding area, her heels clicking rapidly against the floor. "Your Honor, what in God's name is going on? I just heard the most ridiculous rumor." She froze upon seeing Marcus in detention clothing. Behind her, Public Defender Michael Chen appeared, his usual composed demeanor shattered by the sight of the respected judge behind bars. "I was arrested last night," Marcus stated simply, standing up. Officers Barrett and Conway seemed to think my taillight was out. Interesting how it was working perfectly during inspection this morning. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Martinez's face darkened with understanding, while Chen began furiously taking notes on his phone. Release him immediately. Martinez commanded the court officers, but Marcus held up his hand. I'd like to go through standard morning processing first, he said firmly. I've learned quite a bit spending the night here. Did you know the temperature drops to near freezing at 2 a.m.? Or that the breakfast sandwich contains bread that expired 3 days ago? Court clerk Patricia Rodriguez arrived with a stack of papers, stopping short at the sight before her. Your Honor, your 9 a.m. docket will need to be reassigned, Marcus finished. Though I'd like to observe how my cases are typically handled when I'm not on the bench. The next hour was a whirlwind of activity. Word had reached the Chief Justice, who arrived personally to handle the situation. The police chief called repeatedly, his increasingly desperate messages going unanswered as Marcus insisted on completing the standard release procedure. In the processing area, Marcus watched as other detainees were hurried through their paperwork, many without proper explanation of their rights. He noted how his own release papers were handled with extraordinary care, every detail double-checked, while others were processed with barely a glance. Your personal items, Judge Thompson, Officer Wilson said, handling the evidence bag like it contained priceless artifacts. Marcus noticed how the young man who'd been processed just before him had his belongings practically tossed at him. As Marcus changed back into his suit, now wrinkled from the night's events, he could hear the commotion building outside. News of his arrest had leaked, and reporters were gathering at the courthouse steps. We can take you out through the private entrance, Chief Justice Roberts offered, looking concerned. No, Marcus replied firmly, straightening his tie. I'll leave through the front, just like everyone else does. Before heading out, Marcus stopped by the holding cells where he'd spent the night. Derek, the young man he'd spoken with, was being led to his arraignment. You're a judge? Derek asked incredulously, finally understanding why the officers had been so deferential. Yes, Marcus replied. And I'd like you to know that your case will be heard in my courtroom this afternoon. I think we need to have a serious discussion about that allegedly broken taillight. As Marcus walked through the courthouse corridors, he was struck by how differently everyone looked at him now, not with the usual respect for his position, but with a new understanding. He had experienced what countless defendants went through daily, and that knowledge showed in his eyes. Reaching the courthouse steps, Marcus faced the gathered media. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but he held up his hand for silence. The story he was about to tell would change more than just his courtroom. It would shine a light on a system that desperately needed reform, starting right here in his jurisdiction. Behind him, he could see officers Barrett and Conway being escorted into the building through a side entrance, their faces ashen as they realized the full magnitude of their actions from the previous night. The real work was about to begin. The Internal Affairs conference room was tensely quiet as Captain Diana Rodriguez reviewed the body camera footage for the fourth time. She sat at the head of a long table, flanked by IA investigators and police department legal counsel. The footage playing on the large screen showed Marcus Thompson's arrest from multiple angles, each view more damning than the last. Pause it there, Rodriguez commanded, pointing to the screen where Officer Barrett could be clearly seen twisting Marcus's arm unnecessarily. Add that to the list of excessive force incidents, and mark the timestamp where Officer Conway falsely claimed to smell contraband. That's the third false statement we documented. Across the table, Police Union Representative Thomas Blake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The evidence was overwhelming, making his usual defensive tactics useless. The officers have agreed to fully cooperate, Blake offered weakly, knowing he had little leverage. They're prepared to accept whatever disciplinary action the department deems appropriate. Appropriate? Rodriguez's voice was sharp. They racially profiled and wrongfully arrested a sitting judge. The media's having a field day, civil rights organizations are demanding action, and we've got protesters outside every precinct in the city. The door opened, and Chief of Police William Henderson entered, his face grave. The mayor just called. Judge Thompson's case has gone national. We've got cameras from every major network camped outside headquarters. In another room down the hall, Officers Barrett and Conway sat separately with their respective investigators. Barrett's previous bravado had evaporated entirely as he watched his own body camera footage. "Can you explain why you escalated a routine traffic stop into an arrest?" Investigator Sarah Chen asked, her pen poised over her notepad. Barrett wiped sweat from his forehead. I thought he was being disrespectful. By asking why he was stopped, by stating his rights. Please point out the disrespect, Chen pressed, her voice carefully neutral but her eyes hard. Meanwhile, Conway was crumbling under questioning in the adjacent room. "We just assumed. A black man in that neighborhood at night." "You assumed what, exactly?" Investigator Marcus Rodriguez interrupted. "Please finish that sentence for the record." The investigation continued throughout the day. Technical experts analyzed the patrol car's dashcam footage, documenting how Marcus's taillights were clearly functioning. GPS data confirmed he'd been driving exactly at the speed limit. Audio enhancement of the body cameras revealed every discriminatory comment muttered by the officers. By late afternoon, the evidence had painted a clear picture of racial profiling, excessive force, and false arrest. The department's legal team was already preparing for the inevitable civil rights lawsuit. The word had come down that Judge Thompson was more interested in systemic change than financial compensation. Captain Rodriguez called a final meeting to present her findings to the chief. Officers Barrett and Conway violated 17 departmental policies and potentially broke multiple federal civil rights laws. Their previous arrest records show a pattern of similar behavior. We've identified 28 suspicious traffic stops involving minority drivers in the past year alone. Chief Henderson nodded grimly. "Recommendations?" "Immediate termination," Rodriguez stated firmly. "Criminal charges for false arrest and civil rights violations. Complete review of all their previous arrests, and mandatory retraining for their entire precinct on racial bias and proper arrest procedures." The chief signed the paperwork without hesitation. "Make it happen. And get me Judge Thompson's office on the phone. He's requested to be kept informed of our progress." As the sun set over the city, Barrett and Conway were called in to receive their fate. Their badges and service weapons were collected, their lockers cleared out, and their access to the building revoked. Both men left the station through the back door, hoping to avoid the media still camped outside. In her office, Captain Rodriguez finished her final report, adding one last note. "This incident has exposed serious systemic issues within our department. Judge Thompson's wrongful arrest, while traumatic, may serve as the catalyst for long overdue reforms in police training, accountability, and community relations." She closed the file and looked at the stack of cases on her desk, other incidents of potential racial profiling that needed review. Thanks to Judge Thompson's experience, these cases would now receive the scrutiny they deserved. The investigation was ending, but the real work of reform was just beginning. Part 7. The Courtroom Revelation. 2 weeks after the arrest, the marble halls of the courthouse were packed with spectators, reporters, and legal observers. The disciplinary hearing for Officers Barrett and Conway was scheduled for 9 a.m. in courtroom 304, and rumors had spread about who would be presiding. Barrett and Conway sat nervously at the defendant's table, their newly hired attorneys whispering last-minute advice. Both former officers wore ill-fitting suits, a far cry from their once proud uniforms. Neither had slept well the night before, haunted by the knowledge that their careers were effectively over. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom. "The Honorable Judge Marcus Thompson presiding." The color drained from Barrett's face as Judge Thompson emerged from his chambers, his black robes flowing behind him. Conway gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. Neither had known who would be presiding over their hearing until this moment. "Please be seated," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the same authority it had when he tried to inform them of his identity during the arrest. His eyes swept over the packed courtroom, lingering briefly on the former officers. "Case number 2025 CR 789, disciplinary hearing for former officers James Barrett and Michael Conway," the clerk announced, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. Marcus adjusted his glasses, the same ones that had clattered to the pavement during his arrest. "Would the defendants please rise?" Barrett and Conway stood on shaky legs. Gone was their previous arrogance, replaced by visible fear as they faced the man they had wrongfully arrested. "Your Honor," Barrett's attorney began, We request that you recuse yourself from this case due to obvious conflict of interest. Denied, Marcus replied firmly. As the victim of the defendant's actions, my first-hand experience provides unique insight into this case. However, I assure everyone present that justice will be served fairly and without malice. The proceedings began with the prosecution presenting evidence, body camera footage, dash cam recordings, and witness statements. The young couple who had recorded the incident testified about what they'd seen. The elderly woman from the holding cell spoke about how Judge Thompson had helped her understand her rights. Throughout the morning, Marcus maintained absolute professionalism, showing no sign of personal vengeance. He listened intently to testimony about the officers' history of racial profiling, their pattern of excessive force, and their numerous violations of department policy. During a particularly difficult moment, when the enhanced audio revealed Barrett's racist comments during the arrest, Conway broke down crying. "Your Honor," he stammered. We had no idea who you were." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "And would it have made a difference if you had known? Should any citizen, regardless of their position, be treated the way you treated me that night?" The question hung heavy in the air. Barrett stared at the floor, unable to meet the judge's gaze. As the evidence presentation concluded, Marcus removed his glasses and addressed the courtroom. "What happened 2 weeks ago was not about me. It was about a system that allows such behavior to persist. It was about every citizen who has faced similar treatment but lacked the resources or position to seek justice." He turned his attention to the defendants. "You didn't see me as a judge that night. You didn't see me as a professional, a son visiting his elderly mother, or even as a human being deserving of basic respect. You saw only the color of my skin and made assumptions that led to actions that have now ended your careers." The afternoon sun filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom as Marcus prepared to deliver his ruling. The reporters leaned forward, pens poised. Civil rights activists held their breath. Police union representatives shifted nervously in their seats. Marcus picked up his gavel, its weight familiar in his hand. In this moment, he wasn't just a judge delivering a ruling. He was a symbol of the change that needed to happen in the justice system. His decision would send a message far beyond this courtroom, touching every precinct, every traffic stop, and every interaction between law enforcement and the communities they served. The room fell completely silent as he began to speak, all eyes fixed on the man who had transformed from a wrongfully arrested citizen to the very embodiment of justice's balancing scales. Judge Marcus Thompson delivered his ruling with measured clarity, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "Former officers Barrett and Conway, please rise for your sentencing." The two men stood, their shoulders slumped under the weight of their actions. The morning light streaming through the courthouse windows seemed to spotlight them at this crucial moment. "This court finds you both guilty of civil rights violations, false arrest, excessive use of force, and official misconduct," Marcus began. "However, this sentence will focus not on punishment alone, but on education and reform." He paused, looking directly at the former officers. "You will each serve 1,000 hours of community service in predominantly African American neighborhoods. This service will include working with youth programs, attending community meetings, and participating in racial bias awareness workshops." Barrett and Conway exchanged uncertain glances as Marcus continued. "Additionally, you will both enroll in a 6-month intensive training program focused on cultural sensitivity and civil rights law. You'll then spend 2 years working with police cadets, sharing your experience as a cautionary tale of how bias can corrupt law enforcement." The judge leaned forward slightly. "Your police pensions will be partially redirected to fund new training programs for the department. The remaining portion will help establish a legal aid fund for victims of racial profiling." Marcus then turned his attention to the broader implications of the case. "Furthermore, this court is implementing new requirements for all law enforcement in our jurisdiction. Every officer will now undergo quarterly bias training. Body cameras must remain activated during all civilian interactions. Traffic stop data will be reviewed monthly for patterns of racial profiling." In the gallery, civil rights activists nodded approvingly while police union representatives scribbled furious notes. Reporters rushed to capture every word as Marcus outlined his comprehensive reform plan. "A civilian oversight committee will be established," he continued. This committee will include community leaders, legal experts, and representatives from minority communities. They will have the authority to review police conduct and recommend policy changes. Marcus then addressed the packed courtroom directly. What happened to me that night happens to countless citizens who don't have the privilege of my position. Today's ruling isn't about revenge. It's about transformation. We must turn this moment of injustice into a catalyst for lasting change. As he spoke, Barrett finally raised his eyes to meet the judge's gaze. "Your Honor," he said, his voice trembling, "I want to apologize. Not just for not recognizing you, but for not recognizing the humanity in any of the people we wrongly targeted." Conway nodded, tears running down his face. "We became the very thing we swore to fight against when we joined the force. We betrayed our badges and our community." Marcus acknowledged their words with a solemn nod. "Your remorse is noted. Use this experience to help others understand the devastating impact of racial bias in law enforcement." The judge then made one final announcement. "I will be establishing a monthly open court session where citizens can share their experiences with law enforcement. These testimonies will become part of our ongoing police training program. Only by listening to those we serve can we truly protect and serve all communities equally." As Marcus brought down his gavel, the sound resonated through the courtroom like a bell tolling for change. Reporters rushed out to file their stories, civil rights leaders hugged each other, and the former officers were led away to begin their journey of redemption. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his chambers, reviewing the day's events. On his desk lay hundreds of letters from citizens sharing similar stories of profiling and discrimination. Each one strengthened his resolve to use his position to effect real change. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Derek, the young man he'd met in the holding cell that night. "Judge Thompson, I just wanted to thank you. My case was dismissed, and I've been accepted into the Civilian Oversight Committee." Marcus smiled, gesturing for Derek to sit. "Change happens one story, one person at a time," he said. "What happened to me was unfortunate, but it opened doors for voices that needed to be heard." As the sun set over the city, Marcus knew that while justice had been served in his case, the real work was just beginning. The path to true reform would be long, but tonight had marked a significant first step toward a more equitable justice system for all.